Well, yes, of course, this is still very vivid in my mind. I was very fortunate to sit in at every meeting in the 1970s with Mao, Zhou, and then Deng Xiaoping. The Mao meeting was, of course, particularly dramatic. We had just arrived in China. This is in February 1972, and about an hour or two after we'd gotten into our guest house, Zhou and I came back and told Kissinger that Chairman Mao wanted to see President Nixon. Now, this was the typical Chinese emperor-like behavior where you just summon someone to come see you. But we were delighted because this showed that Mao was putting his stamp of approval on this visit from the very beginning. Usually he waits to the end. So Nixon asked Kissinger to go along, excluded Secretary Rogers, as he had been doing on most sensitive issues. And to my everlasting gratitude, Kissinger asked me to accompany him because I'd been in charge of the briefing books. And also he wanted to focus on the meeting and not have to worry about taking notes. And I was pretty good at note taking. Not pretty good, very good. At the end of the meeting, Nixon and Kissinger turned to Zhou Enlai and said, Mr. Lord was never at this meeting, and asked them, and they did cut me out of all the photos and the communiques. So for years, everyone in the world except my wife thought only Nixon and Kissinger were at this meeting. They did this for a good reason. It was overly humiliating for the Secretary of State Rogers not to be included, but to have a third person, a young 30-year-old aide to Kissinger being the third person was too much humiliation. So they correctly cut me out, in my view, although I was obviously disappointed. A year later, on another trip with Kissinger, Zhou Enlai gave me a photograph proving that, in fact, I was actually at the meeting. We had only 48 hours. We had 17 hours of discussions with Zhou Enlai and his top lieutenants. The Chinese wanted to make it look like Nixon was eager to come to China, and they were gracious enough to invite him. We generally wanted them to look like it was clearly in the common interest, and the Chinese were anxious to invite him. So we worked out some middle-level language, basically saying the Chinese, knowing of Nixon's interest, invited him, and he gladly accepted. Most people think Kissinger was the first one to go into China on that secret trip. But as the Pakistani plane, filled with Pakistanis up front, got close to the Chinese border, I was in the front of the plane, Kissinger was in the back, so I got into China's airspace and territory to be the first American official after 22 years to visit China. Shortly after the secret and the president's trip, Japan went ahead with diplomatic relations, as did some European countries, and the Chinese got into the United Nations. That was one goal. The other goal was to balance the Soviets, and that happened. We, in turn, got immediate progress with Moscow, got some help in the Vietnam War, lifted the morale of the American people, showed we were a credible world power to other countries. We, of course, had to enunciate a general one China policy, which we did, and to this day remains ambiguous, and people have trouble defining it, which shows that it was a genius invention, because that's the only way we could get around this issue for both sides. And Japan, feeling betrayed that we had leapfrogged them in our discussions with China, they had been anxious to move ahead, but held back because of us. We went ahead and got ahead of them. If there's one mistake we made, it was not on the substance, not on the secrecy in general, but we should have handled the Japanese factor well. It hurt us a great deal.
How would you compare the Beijing of 72 with the Beijing of today, with the Beijing under Xi Jinping's governance?
There are some similarities between Mao and Xi. You have now Xi promoting the cult of personality like Mao did. Both of them extremely ruthless and repressive. Xi being the most ruthless since Mao, without any question. The big difference, of course, is that Mao tended to delegate day-to-day affairs to Zhou Enlai and others, whereas Xi is increasingly in control of absolutely everything. Xi is beginning to project this as a model for the world as opposed to the Western democracies. whereas his predecessors all said, you do whatever you want in your society, just leave us alone. Kissinger is very right to keep pointing out the dangers of these two great countries falling into conflict. I'd say we've climbed a little bit higher in the foothills, so it is even more dangerous than it was 2 years ago. I don't believe we will go to war. It's so overwhelmingly against each side's interests, so dangerous. It's not going to happen, but we can't be complacent. We got to have guardrails and make sure we don't fall into conflict through misjudgment or miscalculation or accident.